Montgomery, Alabama. April 12, 1969. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of humidity that clings to your skin and hums with electricity before a storm. Inside the Montgomery Coliseum, 35,000 people were packed shoulder to shoulder, sweat glistening under golden spotlights that cut through the haze of cigarette smoke. The crowd was restless, ecstatic, alive. They had come to see the king, Elvis Presley, the man who could make an entire generation swoon with a single curl of his lip. He stood center stage in a gleaming white jumpsuit, its rhinestones catching every flicker of light like shattered stars. The first notes of "Suspicious Minds" drifted through the air, slow and hypnotic, wrapping around the audience like a spell. The Sweet Inspirations, for black women in shimmering gold dresses, swayed behind him, their voices soaring in perfect harmony. They were the soul to his rock, the warmth to his fire, and for a moment, it felt like heaven had come to Montgomery. Before we go deeper, if you're moved by stories like this, by the untold moments that shaped music history, take a second to subscribe, like, share, and comment. Let's keep these legends alive, together. Because what you're about to read isn't just about Elvis Presley, it's about courage, decency, and the kind of humanity that can change the world in 3 minutes flat. The song built to its crescendo. Elvis turned, flashed that half-smile, and motioned to the band. The horns kicked in, the drums rolled, and the Sweet Inspirations harmonies soared higher and higher. But then, it happened. From somewhere in the front rows, maybe 20 feet from the stage, a voice tore through the music like a blade. "Get those, racial slur, off the stage." The words sliced the air, everything stopped, the guitars faltered, the drums fell silent. The Sweet Inspirations froze mid-note. A few gasps rippled through the audience, followed by an uneasy murmur, then a wave of whispering like dry leaves in the wind. Elvis turned slowly, eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stared. Those who were there that night say they'll never forget his face, the sudden stillness, the fire that flickered behind his blue eyes. Then Elvis did something that no one expected. He took the microphone off the stand, walked to the edge of the stage, and looked straight at the man who had shouted. "Sir," he said, voice calm but trembling with fury. "We don't do that here." The crowd fell utterly silent. You could hear the whir of the stage lights. "These ladies," Elvis continued, gesturing to the Sweet Inspirations behind him, "are some of the finest singers in the world. They're my friends. They're my family on this stage. You don't talk to them like that. Not here. Not ever." A long pause hung in the air. The man who'd yelled sat frozen, his face pale under the harsh lights. Somewhere in the back, a lone voice started clapping. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire Coliseum erupted in applause, a thunderous, roaring wave that shook the floor. Elvis turned back to the band. "Let's start that one over," he said quietly, and just like that, he began to sing again. But something had changed. This time, the song carried a different kind of weight. His voice cracked with raw emotion. The Sweet Inspirations sang with tears in their eyes. Even the band played differently, as if they knew they were part of something larger than music, something historic. That night, the king of rock and roll wasn't just performing. He was standing up for what was right. The headlines the next morning were divided. Some papers in the North called him a hero of decency. Others, especially in parts of the South, accused him of betraying his roots. But Elvis didn't care. He had grown up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, surrounded by gospel choirs and blues clubs. He knew exactly where his music came from the black musicians who taught him rhythm, soul, and truth. In a 1970 interview, when asked about that night, Elvis simply said, "Music don't have a color. Soul is soul. You feel it, or you don't." It wasn't the kind of quote the press could sensationalize. It was simple. Honest. And it was Elvis. That moment in Montgomery wasn't just about shutting down a racist outburst. It was about connection, about a man who understood that the very thing that made him the king was the blending of cultures, the breaking of barriers. He had been criticized before. Some said he stole black music. But if you listened closely, Elvis never pretended otherwise. He gave credit where it was due. He lifted up the people who helped shape him. The Sweet Inspirations would later say that after that concert, they felt seen in a way they hadn't before. Elvis didn't have to do that, said Estelle Brown, one of the singers. But he did. And that told us everything we needed to know about who he really was. The rest of the tour wasn't easy. Word spread fast through the South, and some ticket sales dipped. There were boycotts, angry letters, even threats. But Elvis refused to replace the Sweet Inspirations. They're staying, he told his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. If I lose fans over that, then I'll sing to empty seats. He never had to. In fact, that defiance only deepened his legend. Because for every fan he lost, he gained another who saw in him something greater than fame, integrity. Behind the glitter and the jumpsuits, Elvis Presley was a man wrestling with his place in a changing America. The 1960s had torn the country apart: civil rights marches, assassinations, war. And here he was, the boy from Tupelo, standing at the crossroads of it all, using the one weapon he had, music. Some historians later argued that the Montgomery incident marked a turning point for Elvis. After 1969, his concerts became more spiritual, more introspective. Songs like "If I Can Dream," performed just a year earlier in his '68 comeback special, took on new meaning. There must be lights burning brighter somewhere, he had sung. Eyes lifted toward the heavens. That it was as if he was searching for something beyond the stage lights, and maybe, that night in Montgomery, he found it. If you were there, you'd remember how the room changed after he started singing again. The audience, once divided by hate, fear, and ignorance, seemed to move as one. The song stretched longer than usual, almost like a prayer. When he finished, Elvis didn't say another word. He just nodded to the band, put down the mic, and walked off stage. Backstage, the Sweet Inspirations found him sitting alone, still in his jumpsuit, staring at the floor. They thanked him. He smiled softly and said, "Don't thank me. That's how it should be." That's who Elvis Presley was, behind the myth, not the caricature of fame, not the tabloid headlines, but a man who understood the weight of his influence. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, had his demons, his indulgences. But in that moment, on that night, he stood taller than any rhinestone crown. That moment, small, unscripted, and almost lost to time, became a part of the untold story of the king of rock and roll. Years later, when people talked about Elvis, they often mentioned Graceland, Vegas, or his tragic final days. But those who were close to him, the bandmates, the backup singers, the crew, they remembered Montgomery. They remembered the look in his eyes, the silence before he spoke, the courage it took to stand up to hate in front of 35,000 people. There's an old recording from that tour, a grainy reel-to-reel tape that captures the faint echo of the moment. You can hear the gasp, the silence, and then Elvis's voice, steady, resolute, cutting through it all. "We don't do that here." For simple words. But in 1969 Alabama, they meant everything. Over time, the story faded into whispers, buried beneath decades of tabloid headlines and myth-making. But the Sweet Inspirations never forgot. Neither did the fans who were there that night. One of them, a young black teenager named Marvin Taylor, would later say, "I was 12 years old. My daddy didn't like Elvis. He said he was just another white man singing our songs. But when I saw what he did that night, I went home and told him, 'Daddy, this one's different.' That's what music does when it's real. It doesn't just entertain, it transforms. It bridges divides. It reminds us that decency isn't a show, it's a choice, and maybe that's the true legacy of Elvis Presley. Not just the swiveling hips or the gold records or the screaming crowds. But the quiet, defiant acts of grace, the moments that never made it into the movies, but changed people's hearts. When the lights finally went down that night in Montgomery, and the crowd filed out into the humid Alabama air, no one could quite explain what they had witnessed. Some called it powerful. Some called it uncomfortable. But no one forgot it, because sometimes history doesn't happen in speeches or wars. Sometimes it happens in the space between two notes, in a silence that demands courage, in a voice that says, softly but firmly, we don't do that here. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the boy from Tupelo, the man who could turn music into magic, proved that night that greatness isn't measured in fame, but in character, and for 3 minutes in Montgomery, Alabama, he reminded the world what that really means. Years later, when the roar of the crowds had faded and Graceland had become a shrine instead of a home, Elvis would sometimes sit alone in the jungle room with a guitar on his knee and remember Montgomery. The house was quiet, except for the slow hum of the ceiling fan and the faint echo of a gospel station on the radio. He'd strummed the same 4 chords that opened suspicious minds, the same rhythm that had carried him through that night, and he'd see those faces again. He'd see the sweet inspirations, their golden gowns glinting beneath the hot stage lights, smiling through tears as they finished that song. He'd see the faces in the crowd, stunned into silence, then lifted into applause that shook the rafters. And sometimes, when the weight of his fame felt too heavy, he'd whisper to himself, "We don't do that here." A reminder, maybe, that the man behind the legend still had something worth standing for. Fame had a way of rewriting stories, sanding down the edges until they fit neatly into headlines. But not that one. The Montgomery moment survived in memories, in letters, in the quiet gratitude of those who knew what it meant. In an age when the country was still bleeding from the wounds of segregation, a man as famous as Elvis Presley taking a stand in the Deep South mattered. It didn't fix the world, but it showed a glimpse of what it could become. The sweet inspirations kept touring with him until the very end. They sang through the Vegas years, through exhaustion and superstardom, through heartbreak and laughter. On stage, they were family. Off stage, they were sanctuary. When Elvis's health began to fail, they stayed, not because of contracts, but because of love. "He treated us like sisters," Estelle Brown would later say. That's something people don't talk about enough. Sometimes, history remembers the music but forgets the man. It's easier to immortalize a voice than a conscience. But the truth is, the king of rock and roll didn't just change how music sounded, he changed what it could mean. He proved that the stage wasn't just a place for performance, but a platform for principle. And that night in 1969, under the hot lights of Montgomery, he turned a concert into a moment of reckoning. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it still, the faint reverb of a microphone, the soft intake of breath before courage takes form. Elvis Presley standing tall, framed in white and gold, speaking not as a superstar but as a man. We don't do that here. And maybe that's why his story endures, because beneath the glitter and myth, there was still that same boy from Tupelo, raised on gospel truth and the sound of justice in a song that so remember him not just as the king, but as the man who reminded the world, even in the heart of Alabama, that decency can stop the music, and still make it louder than ever. If this story moved you, don't let it fade away. Subscribe, like, share, and comment to keep the untold story of Elvis Presley alive. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of courage echo louder than any song, and the king's voice still calls out, decades later, reminding us all, we don't do that here.